So, section 3. So what I'm going to do from now on is, for the rest of this talk, is I'm just going to really quickly run through 4 different types of conceptual engineering project. And I'm going to sort of think about what would make each one of these implementable, and then sort of look at how challenging the implementation challenge is in each case. As I've already said, it's not going to surprise you that I'm going to bring speaker meaning into quite a lot of this, and you're all welcome to pick me up and object to its use in any given case. But again, what I want to really urge is that we should look at each of these projects individually, rather than sort of starting with these sort of theoretical assumptions. So I'm not going into this assuming that speaker meaning is going to be the answer to them all, although I mean, at least I'm not doing that consciously. Maybe subconsciously that's what's happening, but that's fine. This isn't, don't psychologize me. Take me at my argument's word. Okay, local terminological introduction. So by this, I just mean the kind of thing that we all do, where at the beginning of papers, we give a definition for a core term that we're going to use. And this will often be the case that the definitions that are available aren't quite what we want, right? So we come up with our own definition, which is slightly tweaked, and we say, this is how we're going to use that term, and then we use it. And people who are reading it understand what we're doing, and we do some philosophy, and it's all great. This happens at the beginning of research papers, not just in philosophy, but elsewhere as well. Just across the board, this in other disciplines, this happens. I think it happens at the beginning of legal contracts. It happens in policy works. If you look at policies by whatever organizations have policies, they will often involve sort of stipulating definitions, just giving definitions for terms and then using them accordingly within that document, within that policy. And so the kind of thing I have in mind here, so if you've read that Mind article, you'll recognize the social media argument. I'm just going to read out the underlined section. Right, so this is it's a made-up argument, but someone's giving this argument. That's the context. And they say, there is the person who is opposed to social media, often having had and closed a Facebook account due to its negative effects on society. Call her the Luddite. Now, to fight against the spread of social media, we should not seek to increase the number of Luddites. Now, if you've spent a bit of time reading this, and I read it quite quickly, you would understand exactly what's going on there. The second use of Luddites is explicitly picking up on the definition that I've given earlier on. Right? There's nothing unusual about what's going on here. I give a definition, I make it clear that that's how I'm going to use the word Luddite, I then use it, and you understand what I'm saying. If you don't understand, if you don't interpret me as using the Luddite in the way that I've just introduced it, the second sentence just makes no sense at all. Right? Luddites are the people who were against technological change in the 1800s or whatever. Right? So they just got nothing to do with social media whatsoever. But this makes sense precisely because you interpret my use of Luddite in accordance with the definition for it that I have just made explicit. To make sense of what's going on here then, we just don't need to talk about semantics, meta-semantics, or even concepts at all. All we need to note is that the author has made her intended use of Luddite clear, made it explicit, and then used the term accordingly. Right? And we can just understand this in terms of speaker meaning. We don't need to talk about anything else. You don't have to understand it in terms of speaker meaning if you don't want to, but that's all we need. And in these sorts of cases, I just think it's easy to give both a weak response and a strong response to the implementation challenge. How do we, in what sense are we implementing? Well, just look at what we need for the project. All we need for the project in this case is for the audience, the careful audience, if you like, to understand what's being used by the term. How do we achieve that? Well, just be really clear and explicit about how you're using your terms and then use them accordingly. Perhaps there's a little bit more that needs to be said, but something along these lines is going to be enough, I think, for what I've called a strong response to the implementation challenge, which shows that it's realistic and feasible for us to implement conceptual revisions. Okay. Let me just note that I forgot for a while that I was showing my screen and might have been flicking up and down a little bit. If I did that, I'm sorry. Hopefully it's clear roughly where we are again now, which is section 4. Disciplinary terminological introduction and refinement. So by this, I simply mean, okay, here's an example of what I mean. Rigid designator. a term introduced by Kripke and now widely used and recognized across, at the very least, philosophy of language. So this is disciplinary terminological introduction in the sense that he introduced a term and it's now sort of spread and has become standard across a whole discipline. Here, the discipline being philosophy of language. Okay, so what happens in this kind of case? I think in the Kripke case, at least, the initial act of introduction is just an act of local terminological introduction. I don't think anything else is going on. He stipulates how he's going to, what he's going to mean by the term, and then he uses it accordingly. Now, the key difference between the rigid designator case and the Luddite case, right, then this is going to be is sort of obvious, is that the rigid designator, that term caught on, right? Other people use it, and they use it in one of two senses. Either they offer their own version of the definition of rigid designator and use it accordingly. If they do that, right, it's a little tweak on Kripke's term. They're definitely picking up on his work where he started, or else they just explicitly defer to Kripke's definition. Right, but what's important here is that Kripke didn't have to do anything special, right, to achieve this. He didn't have to go and fiddle around with the metasemantic base or whatever it is that Kaplan, however it is that he phrases it. He didn't even have to sort of go out and try to work to align people's intentions or anything like that. What he did was he found a really fruitful definition that was fruitful in the particular context of philosophy of language at that time. And he used it in an incredibly high profile text that almost everyone in that discipline was going to read. Now, it's sort of, okay, the point that I want to make here really is that if your aim is to introduce a term across a whole discipline, then if you meet those preconditions, right, if you've got a definition which is actually really fruitful in the context of that discipline at that time, and you're in the position to publish in an incredibly high profile text that lots of people are going to read, then probably like it's not that difficult to achieve. Given those preconditions, a strong response to the implementation challenge is possible, right? There's a clear strategy for how you can achieve implementation. What do? You write your book or whatever it is, you introduce the terms you want to use it, you then put that to lots of theoretical work, you then publish the book, and I don't know, it's going to be read by people. So people are going to like it and people are going to understand what's going on, and quite likely they'll pick up that term and it will get used. However, for the vast majority of us, and that's definitely true in my case, probably true of most people in the audience, probably true of almost everyone in the discipline, except for the Kripkes amongst us, this strong response isn't going to be available for us. Like in our cases, at most we're going to be able to get, if you like, a weak response to the implementation challenge. If I want to change if I want to introduce a term and get everyone in my discipline to use it, yes, I can try and do the things that I just said that Kripke did, but probably I'm not going to be as successful. In fact, I'm quite unlikely to be successful because I just don't have the influence that he had. Yeah, I know it's a shame. I should have more influence, but I don't. So I think weak response is quite easy. It's possible. We can see how it's possible. Strong response, only in a very, very few cases, given really demanding preconditions, are we going to be able to give a strong response to the implementation challenge here. Okay, right. I'm going to speed up and I might skip the last section. Number 5, social justice. So one standard way of interpreting Haslanger's ameliorative project is that she's aiming to develop accounts of race and gender that will be effective tools in the fight against injustice. So for present purposes, I'm just going to assume that success in this project basically requires her definitions to receive widespread uptake in the sense of people just across the population using her definitions in some way or another, and that's required. It's probably because, so one way you might think of this is that, say, what women are is a social construction, what men are is a social construction, and that relies on how people across the board speak and think about men and women, and so you need to change like how they're using terms, how they're thinking about things in order to change the social construction. And yeah, and so that's presumably what's required to increase or enhance social justice in this case. So something like that, I think, is going on. But notice immediately that changing the semantic meaning of woman, I think, isn't going to be sufficient, actually, for Haslanger in this kind of case. And specifically, that's because, well, certainly she's endorsing a form of externalism, and lots of people these days are externalists. But as soon as we assume externalism, there is a disconnect between semantic meaning and how people use terms, how people think, what people think the meaning of terms are. So to really achieve Haslanger's goals here, I don't think it's going to be enough for her to simply change the semantic meaning of woman. It's not obvious to me that that's necessary either. Okay, so what is required? Well, okay, I don't know what's required. Here's something that I think would be enough for Haslanger. So suppose that Haslanger succeeds. So this is obviously going to start off by being like, you know, way too broad. But suppose that Haslanger succeeds in getting every person to speak mean her definition of woman by default. And what I mean by speaker meaning by default is captured by these 3 bullet points. So each person X is going to be such that X is disposed to only use the word woman to people who fall under Haslanger's definition. X is disposed to accept applications of woman to anyone who falls under Haslanger's definition. And when asked what they mean by woman, X will point to Haslanger's definition. Right, so that's kind of rough and ready. And if people have complaints about that, I'm interested in just refining that further. This is the first time that that set of definitions has gone outside of my mind. So yeah, comments on that, very welcome. Right, so suppose that Haslanger succeeds in getting everyone's use of woman to change in accordance with those 3 bullet points. What would follow? Okay, so here I'm going to quote from a paper of mine which is forthcoming, and I'm doing that principally to tell you all that there's a paper forthcoming in Inquiry. It's going to be published in a day or 2. I was hoping it'd be out already, but it's not quite. So keep an eye out for that, and yeah, you'll find more about this type of stuff in there. So what would follow? People would continue to use the terms such as women, man, and etc. to communicate successfully, cementing the new default usage. Eventually, the new definitions would be encoded in dictionaries and taught in schools, and these long-term changes would cause shifts in how people think about gender and race, ultimately affecting people's behavior for the better, hopefully. If such eventuality is obtained, Haslanger would surely deem her project a success. So again, we can make sense of everything that I've just said without thinking about semantics, metasemantics, or concepts at all. Now, I haven't explained all of this simply in terms of speaker meaning. I've appealed to this notion of speaker meaning by default, right? And I've said a little bit about what that is. I've expanded a little bit on that. That's all understood in terms of dispositions, basically, right? So what I'm saying is that the simple account of dispositions, we can make sense of what is needed for these kind of social justice projects to succeed. So how challenging is the implementation challenge in this kind of case? Well, I think there is a weak response available. I think a case can be made that these kind of Haslanger style projects are possible. I haven't given you such a case. I haven't said how you get about doing anything like getting people to change their dispositions in this kind of way. But the kind of thing I have in mind is that you're not going to need to get sort of everyone to change their dispositions. Changing enough broadly is you need to change the critical mass of how people are using the term in that kind of way. And then the sorts of strategies that are going to be used are things like, so Mona was earlier talking about advertising. So that's the kind of thing I have in mind. In the Mind paper, I talk a bit about the idea of sort of influencing people who are going to have influence in different sort of sub-communities and trying to sort of spread the word out, if you like, that way. But that's the sort of thing that's going to have to be said. I think if you do that well, I think you can make a good case that, yeah, it's possible to implement in these kind of cases in this kind of way. I'm not sure there's going to be a strong response available in any given case. I'm not sure we're going to be able to give clear conditions under which so, you know, so getting success in this kind of project, implementing these conceptual visions in the way we want to, is going to be realistic or feasible in any given case. I think it's always going to be a high risk, low chance of success kind of strategy. But I mean, there's more that one could say about that. Okay. Right, so I'm going to try and whiz through. If I take more than 2 minutes, then I might just stop on section 6. Okay, solving philosophical problems. So what about solving philosophical problems? So sometimes people think, when people are talking about conceptual engineering, people just sort of have in mind that conceptual engineers just want to solve philosophical problems using conceptual engineering. Conceptual engineers don't actually seem to talk about this that much. The social justice projects seem to be like far more central to what people talk about. But I think it's interesting and worth discussing. So here is a philosophical problem. How is X such that P? Okay, so I think two broad strategies have been suggested in the literature for using conceptual engineering to solve this kind of problem. Right, so the first one I will call the conservative strategy. So what you do is you introduce a new concept, X prime, you explain how X prime is such that P prime, but you then relate the discussion back to the original problem to gain insight on that original problem, right? So you don't change your original problem at all, right? But you simply do some conceptual engineering and then do some work and then relate that back to the original problem. So this, I think, has been defended by people like Patrick Mayer in 2007 on his work in explication. It's defended by Jonas Schuttbach more recently. And I also think that it's reasonable to interpret Kevin Sharp along the lines of conservative strategy. Whether or not he agrees with that, I have no idea. The second approach is the radical strategy. And for this, you introduce a new concept X, you explain why the original problem should be understood in the new terms rather than the old terms. So you're trying to transform the problem into a new set of concepts. And then you explain how X prime is such that P prime. So I think this has been, I think this plausibly is really what Carnap had in mind when arguing that explication could be used to solve philosophical problems. I think I've used this kind of approach probably a little bit naively in one of my early papers in Erkenntnis. And I also think that Simeon and Kelp defend this sort of project, at least as I interpret them in their newspaper, and she may or may not agree. Moni's either nodding or shaking her head, so I don't know at this stage whether she'll agree with that. But there we are. In both of these cases, I think the introduction of a new concept, we don't need to think of this in any more substantial terms than as the introduction of a technical term. So I don't think we need to do anything more than think of it as local terminological introduction. What we're doing is we're introducing a new concept, and then what do? We have some really difficult philosophical argument to do. One is, on the conservative strategy, you have to argue that this concept is somehow related to the old one. In the radical strategy, you have to argue that this is the better way of thinking about these issues. These aren't easy things, right? But the implementation here is still just gone via, I think still just goes via local terminological introduction. And I've already said, I think this can be understood in terms of speaker meaning. So I think we can make sense of how we might use conceptual engineering to solve philosophical problems just in terms of speaker meaning. Okay, how challenging is the implementation challenge in this case? I don't know. I've outlined the shape of a possible weak response. I definitely haven't gone anywhere near arguing that it's possible to actually solve philosophical problems in this way. I think I've done enough to say it's something that we could try and that could be tried harder. I think Kevin Sharp has gone by far the closest to really doing that using the conservative strategy. Okay. So, and I have no idea what to say about whether the strong response is available here or not. Okay, closing remarks. So how challenging is the implementation challenge? If all we want are weak responses, then I don't think it's that challenging. In the philosophical problems case, I think it's possibly harder, but I don't think it's like a big in principle problem that people like Catherine and Deutsch seem to think. If you want strong responses, then I think it's incredibly challenging in all but the very simplest of cases. Yeah, that is what it is, and that's just fine. Fine is really tough. That's okay. conceptual engineering can be worth doing, even if it's incredibly difficult in some cases. But either way, just to get back to what is the key point that I left sort of 15 minutes ago, case to theory, order theorizing. We should be thinking about looking at different kinds of projects differently and then theorizing about them individually. And if we get the same theory across the board, that's great. But if we don't, that's fine too. What I said about social justice, I think, was quite different to what I said about the other three kinds of project. And I just think that's fine. I don't think that's in any way an objection to anything that I've said. Yeah, so object to me in any individual case if you like, but case to theory, order theorizing, please. And that's it, I'm done.